I read the scripture lesson. It's taken from John chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
Take a moment and look as best as you can. Look behind you, towards the narthex. Imagine yourself standing there with all the parishioners and the scouts. Imagine the conversations and the echoes, the children running around, and people that are pushing, trying to get to either coffee hour or out the door to go home. Can you picture that? Now imagine that everything is just super busy. I'm talking busier than you imagined before. There are people who are selling things, selling animals. There's cows and sheep and doves, and yeah, that's really specific groups of animals, but it's what the text says, so we're just going to go with it. But there's cows and sheep and doves, and they're flying around and they're walking around. And you know, maybe you're here to buy something. Maybe you're here to sell something. Maybe you're here to meet up with somebody to help you change your money. Maybe there's someone in the corner over there who is going to help you change over your cash. Can you picture that? I really want you to take a second and just picture that. You got it? Now, maybe that's something that's easy for you to deal with, all that commotion. Maybe it's something difficult. But whatever the case, in this scenario, the one thing that you know is this. This situation, this exchange of goods in this space, is all completely normal. In fact, not only is it normal to you, it's necessary. Imagine that you need to have money to make a sacrifice in order to come into this sanctuary. Well, where do you get that money from? Say hi to the cows and the sheep and the birds. Oh, and of course, to make that sacrifice, you need to have the right kind of money, the right currency, and so that's where the money changers come in. Can you picture that? All of these people, all of these things playing into a larger system that make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do. It's the way it is. It's the status quo. It is a totally normal part of your life. And then some dude comes in and he just straight up loses it and he starts flipping over furniture and yelling at everybody while chasing them with a whip. A whip! Can you picture that? What do you think your response might be. I don't know about you, but if I was in that situation and somebody did that to me, well, I'd have a few things to say, but I guess the nicest version of it would be, what on earth are you doing? But as it turns out, the answer to that question is one that we need to take seriously, not just in the story, but today, in this moment. Because the answer, the one that we need to hear, is attempting to dismantle everything. Let's consider some background here. The story of Jesus flipping over the tables, or cleansing the temple as it's often called today, shows up in all four Gospels. And unlike the other versions, the one that we heard today that appears in John has some key differences. First of all, it occurs fairly early in the book of John, right after the first miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. In the other Gospels, however, the story appears soon after Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, which we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And in that version, his actions draw the ire of the chief priests and the scribes and the leaders, who are really starting to worry about how many people are listening to Jesus, and they think that something needs to be done about that. But there's no mention of that kind of scorn here in John's version. Rather, there's a question of proof and ask for signs. There's a cryptic statement from Jesus about the temple, one that the people that he spoke to didn't understand, but we do, because the author explains it to us. And we'll come back to that later, but for now, it's important to remember that although the stories may be very familiar to some, this particular version is different. Another important thing to keep in mind is that in this telling of events, Jesus does and says things a little differently. In the other three Gospels, when he sees what's happening with the merchants and the money changers, he drives them out, he overturns the tables, and he stops people from coming in. In Matthew 23:13, in Luke 19:46, in Mark 11:17, Jesus quotes Isaiah 56:7, which states, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." And he follows that up by telling the sellers and the money changers that they have turned the temple, they have turned this house into a den of robbers. That's the phrase he uses, den of robbers. He is bluntly calling these people thieves, pointing out the corruption that has been brought into the temple. But that's not what he calls out in John. When Jesus sees the animals and the sellers and the money changers, he doesn't just drive them out. He makes a whip to force out both human and animal alike. He not only turns over the tables, he pours out coins from the money changers' containers. He puts everything in disarray, turning the whole system upside down, and then exclaims, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Notice how he didn't call anyone a robber. And he's not accusing anyone specifically of corruption. He's simply calling out what's happening for what it is. It is a marketplace. It was supposed to be a marketplace. That scenario we imagined earlier about the back and that was totally normal, it was at the time just that. Totally normal. But Jesus looks at this, at the way the temple system survives, the way that the structures are structured, the way that sacrifices are done, he looks at the status quo and asks, what on earth are you doing? Because in this version of the story, it isn't just about corruption, it's about the existence of these structures in the first place. Jesus isn't mad about the mismanagement, he's mad about the system as a whole. And the system, yeah, it has some problems. It can be corrupted and abused. It does require a specific way of doing things that isn't open to all who wish to do them, even though it's supposedly required. It does fundamentally change the function of God's house. And yes, it's what everyone is used to, and yes, people go along with it just fine. But going along with a system doesn't make it a good system. And that was something they needed to remember then, and it's something that we need to remember now. The next part of the text is interesting. Those around Jesus ask him for a sign for why he was doing what he's doing. They're testing him, which is what they did with prophets to see what was going on. And he responds by telling them that the temple, this temple, he says, if it were destroyed, it would be raised up in 3 days. Well, naturally, this sounds ridiculous. It takes far longer than 3 days to rebuild a temple. It takes far longer than 3 days to rebuild any building, even today. But the thing is, Jesus isn't talking about a building. He's talking about himself. It's a prediction of his own death and resurrection, but it's also a little more than that. It's a shift from a temple of stone and systems to a temple of body and spirit. It's talk of a new system, one that lives not in structure, but in human. It's a challenge to the authority that puts the status quo over people. It's a new way of being, a new way of doing. And we too need a new way of being and a new way of doing. We too live in a time where corruption and abuse happen. We live in a time where not everyone has access to do the things that, not only to do the things that they want, but the things that society says are required of them. We live in a time where some have to work harder, jump through more hoops, complete more tasks than others just to do basic things in their lives. Where things like white supremacy and racism, sexism and toxic masculinity, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and rendering certain people invisible, we live in a time where that's the norm. And what's more, a lot of the time, we're fine with that. We won't say we're fine with it with our words. If anyone asked, we'd make it very clear that we don't think that that's okay, and we know the systems are broken. But at the same time, we won't act. Not always. Not when we're not thinking about it. Not when the system benefits us and we can justify our right to it because, we work hard and we deserve things to be the way that they are. Not when it's awkward or uncomfortable or we're just too tired. Not when it's easier to go with the flow than to question. But that's not what we're called to do, though. It's not what Jesus did. And I'm not saying to start emptying other people's purses or fashioning whips out of belts and extension cords or anything like that. Please don't do that. We don't have to be quite so dramatic. But we do need to do something. We need to find the tables to flip in our own lives. And before anyone questions it, no, I'm not talking about the ones that came with this current administration, at least not just those. The administration and those who seek to profit off of ignorance and bigotry and hatred, yeah, they didn't make things this bad, But with some policies and the actions that are happening, they're making bad situations worse. And so, while it's good that some are rising up against the perils that we're facing today, we must also remember that the status quo has been with us, leading us on, letting us just glide on through. But we don't have to do that. We can work towards obvious justice and less obvious justice. We can fill the streets in this country and all over the world with women's marches, while also making sure that Black women, Asian women, Middle Eastern and Arab women, Latinx women, queer women, trans women, poor women, and women with disabilities are respected and heard when they're marching about things other than the current policy. We can proudly support those who yell out "Me Too" and tell the truth about harassment and assault, while giving consideration to who's being hired. How long are men speaking in conversations versus people of other genders? Or even just, who do we ask in the office to get coffee? We can hold up our youth as they take a stand against gun violence, while at the same time challenging ourselves with the question of why so many youth movements, from SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee from the Civil Rights era, to anti-Vietnam War protesters, to Black Lives Matter, didn't and haven't received the same kind of attention and respect. We can continue to show our love for gay and lesbian people while also remembering that bisexuality exists, and working for equality for sexual orientation while remembering that that is not the same thing as working for equality over gender identity. We can ask ourselves how often our buildings and systems cater to able-bodied people without consideration to people with disabilities. We can question our silence when friends and family make offensive jokes and we feel too uncomfortable to call them out. We can look at who is in the room and who is not and ask ourselves, why? We can flip the tables. We can follow Jesus. We can ask ourselves, what on earth are we doing? And when we do that, when we flip our own tables, we can replace them with new ones. We've seen it happen. We've seen our Boy Scouts become more inclusive, welcoming trans scouts and even girls who wish to be Boy Scouts, like Louisa pointed out earlier. We've seen churches and denominations go from places of strict separation by race, places that condemn LGBTQ people and that silence women, to multi-ethnic, multiracial welcoming communities with ministers and lay leaders of all genders. We've seen a new focus and energy given to immigrants and refugees, with people showing support, showing up, and giving time, money, and items to help others in ways that break the chains of racism and xenophobia. We've seen the times where the system that makes up the status quo has done us no good and required us not only to bring new things to the table, but to replace their tables altogether. In big ways and in little ways, we can do it. We just have to decide to act. You have a picture on your bulletin today. It's a painting that's meant to depict the table from the Last Supper. And it's a very different image from the table in our story in John. It's pretty different even from the Last Supper images that we're used to seeing in art. And that's the point. The table there is one that we look forward to in this time of Lent, in the time that comes in the Easter moment, the one that exists after the resurrection, and the disciples of Jesus say, as the text says, believe in Scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. That table on your bulletin is empty and new and full of possibility. Nothing is on it. No one is sitting at it. It has no status quo. Yet. It was something else. But that something else is gone. And the world around it has changed. It can be our table when we identify the systems around us that are hurting people and decide to actively stop participating in them. It can be our table when we push ourselves out of comfort and complacency to make change in the little ways and the big ways. It can be our table when we follow Jesus and ask ourselves, what are we doing? And then do things another way. That table can be ours. Can you picture it?